would also like to open it up to our other speakers. And you mentioned the possibility of ORV for vampires. So I'd like to direct it back to Conrad. Do you have an opinion? What do you think about oral vaccination of bats, or in particular in regards to vampires in this context? Conrad? I think you're on mute.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I would say it's not a priority, and I wouldn't regard it as a priority. It's a very far end of rabies control and possible elimination, and I would say childhood vaccination and vaccinating humans in these areas where you have bad rabies is a far better approach than to apply oral vaccination to a wildlife species. I think there are lots of hurdles to implement this.
Thank you. I'm also curious, is our colleague from Tunis still on? The discussions about history, colonization, indigenous peoples. I'm wondering, Mariem, are there any corollaries in Tunis or North Africa that are also relevant in your experience based on what we've heard from the New World?
I think the idea of the presentation of Catherine is different from what we are living. I think it's different, but there are many articles that say that rabies has been brought with colonization, but honestly, I'm not sure about this.
I think at least in the New World, it appears to be the case, because it's interesting. And Catherine, I'm wondering if you could bring your opinion. Was rabies present in those dog populations that came across the barrier from the old world to the new? And so when we had indigenous populations in North America, for example, in the far north, do you think that rabies was present then, or was it primarily exacerbated by colonization?
I mean, I think if you look at some of the oral traditions that survive in some of those remote communities, I think there was an awareness of a disease that could be transmitted from foxes to dogs that looked like rabies. When that was introduced, did it come over with the first dogs from through the Alaskan land bridge, tens of thousands of years ago? Is something that can probably be answered by potentially or informed by looking at sort of genetic relationships between the current sort of Arctic fox variants and their relationship to the dog variants. So I think sort of the genetic relationships between the viral strains would probably suggest that that's the case. And I think the oral tradition and the oral awareness of some kind of a disease that was transmitted from foxes would probably suggest that rabies has circulated in the north for a very long time, and was probably brought over with those dog populations. I think that the question, though, is the risk picture for that has changed because of the changing conditions in the way that dogs are managed in the north. And in particularly, I think the breakdown of that human-dog relationship and the breakdown of the traditional means of managing dogs to essentially keep them safe and keep the community safe, that is what has broken down over the last 200 years. And that is what is creating that different risk picture. And fundamentally, I think needs to be addressed right now.
And I'm wondering, Victor, are you still on?
Yes, I'm here.
And how do you think best to implement some of the things that you brought up in terms of rationality? I see that from one of the speakers who posed the question, I see you started to answer, that although setting goals and timetables are somewhat necessarily to start moving, I think there's emerging a consensus, if not because of the pandemic, then for maybe being overarchingly optimistic. Based on the lessons learned in Latin America, should we set the goal towards 2050, 2060, or should we move towards some artificial goalposts in the interim based on some non-technical?
I'm sure you're not expecting a date from me, Charles, and I won't commit to that. I'll just say that objectives are built from both sides, from top to bottom, and also from bottom, all the way up. Coming up with an unrealistic objective, you will only be basically planning for failure, and we already saw the consequences of failure. But you also need to know what capacities you got on the ground in order to establish a realistic objective. And that's what I kept saying during my presentation, that perhaps we don't have the evidence to inform this challenging question, and we need that evidence. But I also replied to the question in the chat, exactly, Terence, about, I think we got the instruments now to start collecting this evidence, which, through SARI or some other tools. Getting this regular knowledge of capacities will allow us to populate a type of evidence in order to inform what is available on the ground, so we can set up a realistic and achievable goal. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Talking about realities, we did have a question from the audience about ORV targeting in the north, both for free-ranging dogs and wildlife in the Arctic. Catherine, Conrad, etc. Since we think of Arctic foxes, at least in the recent past, from the whole Arctic, do we think it's realistic for ORV for Arctic foxes, red foxes in the Arctic, or for those northern latitudes? And what about free-ranging dogs for some of these indigenous communities? Conrad, Catherine, others?
Can I start? I mean, these oral vaccines have been primarily developed for foxes, and so they're long-standing experience. It's just a matter of the size of the area. I could imagine that you could do some kind of baiting and create some kind of buffer zones around populated areas. And at the same time, as we did in Namibia, I mean, you can use these baits and vaccines to protect your dogs. I don't think that is an issue.
Catherine, would you foresee using ONRAB for some of these community dogs?
Yeah, I think sort of there has certainly been discussion about that. The challenge, of course, being that ONRAB is not licensed for use in dogs. And I think the other part of that question is, if we're using it, it would certainly solve the issue of veterinary capacity, right? We have the option to train lay vaccinators in Canada in remote communities that don't have access to vet services. But the creation and maintenance of those training programs and ensuring that those lay vaccinators are safe and everybody's being handled properly, particularly for dogs that are not used to being handled, that don't appreciate being handled at all, that are free roaming and or may not be owned, but are certainly sort of within the community, it would be a really important tool to have in the toolbox. The issue that comes up is that right now we already have issues in terms of public health authorities who do not recognize dogs that are parenterally vaccinated by lay vaccinators. And in this case, we're usually talking about sled dog teams who are then exposed to an Arctic fox, for example, who turns out to be rabid, and quarantine proves impossible. The public health authority or the chief veterinary officer are not able to recognize those dogs as being vaccinated, and the entire sled dog team ends up being put down. Which really creates a sense of disheartening sort of attitudes to, well, we're doing what we can, and yet you still sort of essentially punish us for having our dogs vaccinated. I think the same issue will apply, and perhaps even to a greater extent, if we're looking at orally vaccinating these dogs. So it would be a great tool to have. But what we would really need to have is the agreement and buy-in from the public health authorities to recognize dogs that receive an ORV bait as being vaccinated for the purposes of managing quarantines if those dogs are then subsequently bitten by a rabid animal, and how we treat those dogs in terms of, post-exposure prophylaxis for humans that may be bitten by that dog. So I think it's absolutely something that certainly sort of we are talking about even within sort of the vaccine manufacturers who produce and import vaccines into Canada for rabies. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of getting buy-in from the public health community to recognize that this is a valid tool that is sort of successful and effective in terms of generating immunity against rabies in dog populations in the north.
Yes, and I think these are some of the similar issues that Conrad brought up from Namibia. I see in regards to our audience, Gadosh has his hand raised to the organizers. I don't know if you have the ability to, or if that was an old hand raise. Do you have the ability to open up Gadosh's Jallo's mic? Hunley?
Yes.
Yes. Does Gadosh Jallo, does he have, does that individual have their mic access opened?
Gadosh, can you hear us? Do you have any questions for the chair and our speakers? So, Charles, we have another question in the chatting room.
Yes. Yes, Conrad, could you mention the broad guidance document that's being developed for ORV use in dogs? As if, I mean, it's not the first one, it's not going to be the last one, it's not a new concept, as we say, but would you enlighten us, please?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of efforts going on to provide a concise document on the use of ORV. The last document is, I think, from 2007, the WHO document. And I think countries that want to implement ORV, they're looking for up-to-date information. And it's really difficult to look for OIE guidelines or WAR guidelines, WHO recommendation, and we want to compile all the information, practical guidelines about field trials, what to consider, who to involve, stakeholders, etc., in one concise document. And that should, at the end of the day, be a tripartite or four-partite or whatever, a UAR document with the blessing of WHO, because of these oral rabies vaccines will be applied in close proximity to human beings. The safety issue is of utmost importance. So a lot of countries look for the WHO for guidelines, and there's this outdated document. So it needs to be a One Health document with WOHA and WHO and all other stakeholders involved. And we are hoping to get it finalized for internal review and have it published at least next year, early next year, so to say.
Thank you. And open it up to other speakers or audience members. Are there any closing thoughts, burning questions? Any additional discussion? I don't see any hands or not. Otherwise, I certainly thank all of the speakers for their expertise and sharing their time from around the world, from very late in the evening to very early in the morning, going from east to west. Certainly, we thank Dr. Freuling, who stepped in for our European colleagues who could not be with us from the WHO this morning because of a mission that they're going off to in India. Certainly thank the audience for their time and attention and questions that are out there, and not the least of which to our hosts and the organizers for their journal.